The rumor in Bent Tree said Silas Holt had gone to the church office and bought himself a wife. The rumor was wrong. The paper on Reverend Pike's desk was not a wedding license. It was a work agreement, written in cramped ink across 3 thin pages, stating that Miriam Vale would serve as housekeeper, caretaker, and bookkeeper at Ash Fork Ranch for 76 days. Room, board, $8 a month. And at the end of that term, either party could walk away without explanation. Silas signed before the ink was dry. Miriam did not. She took the pen from the Reverend, set it down, and read the contract from the first line to the last while both men waited. She had 48 hours before Mrs. Bell locked her boarding room from the outside. She had 1 black dress, a pair of winter gloves, and a tin box with $9.17 inside it. She had a little boy buried behind the Methodist cemetery under a cedar marker his father had never lived long enough to see. She needed a roof. But needing a roof did not mean she would walk blind into another man's house. So she read the wages twice. She read the termination clause 3 times. She checked that her name had been spelled correctly, because men who made mistakes on paper often expected women to pay for them in life. Only then did she sign. Reverend Pike smiled as if he had solved something tender. Silas Holt folded the contract and placed it in his coat pocket as if it were a tool, not a promise. Miriam understood that. Tools could save you. Promises had a poorer record. Outside, the first snow of November was moving sideways through the street. Silas's wagon waited at the hitching rail with 2 feed sacks in the back and a gray mare stamping steam into the cold. He offered his hand to help her up. Miriam climbed before he finished offering. For 5 miles they did not speak. Bent Tree disappeared behind them, then the graveyard, then the last dry goods sign swinging in the wind. The prairie opened into a flat gray country where fence posts leaned like tired men, and the winter grass showed through the snow in dull yellow blades. Ash Fork Ranch sat lower than she expected, tucked against a draw with a barn, a smokehouse, 2 corrals, and a house built square enough to endure weather, but plain enough to resent visitors. On the front steps stood a child. She was small, maybe 7, with a knitted cap pulled crooked over brown curls and 1 mitten missing. She had buttoned her coat wrong, top to bottom, as if nobody had corrected it, and she had decided correction was not worth trusting. Silas stopped the wagon. "That's Lottie," he said. "She's been waiting since noon." Miriam looked at the child. The child looked back. There was no shyness in her face, only inspection. Miriam stepped down into the snow and crossed the yard. She did not crouch too quickly, and she did not smile too brightly. Children who had been left by death knew the difference between kindness and performance. "You must be frozen," Miriam said. Lottie considered her. "Are you the woman Papa hired?" "Yes." "Are you going to leave because the house is too quiet?" "No." "You don't know that yet." Miriam looked past her at the house. The curtains were shut. The porch broom had been left bristled down in a drift of snow. A milk pan sat upside down beside the door, frozen to the boards. "I know quiet," Miriam said. "Quiet does not frighten me." Something in Lottie's face unlocked by a fraction. Mrs. Peel said the quiet made her hear herself think. That can be hard on some people. Lottie nodded with the grave satisfaction of a judge hearing useful testimony. Then she reached out, took Miriam's gloved hand, and led her inside. Behind them, Silas remained beside the wagon with the reins in his fist, watching his daughter bring a stranger across his threshold, as if she had been expected all along. The kitchen was colder than the yard. Miriam found the stove, the kindling, the flour barrel, the salt crock, the molasses jug, and the problem with the backdraft before Silas carried her trunk inside. By the time he returned from the barn, the stovepipe was beginning to knock with heat. Lottie sat at the table with both mittens finally found, and Miriam was scraping the bottom of an old bean pot with the calm expression of a woman who knew hunger could be managed if nobody wasted time pretending not to see it. Silas stopped in the doorway. "You don't owe work tonight." "The contract began when I entered the house," Miriam said. "It could begin in the morning." "The stove would still need lighting tonight. Your daughter would still need supper tonight." He looked at Lottie. Lottie looked at the stove as if it had never before occurred to her that warmth could arrive without argument. Silas said nothing. He washed his hands at the pump and sat. Supper was corn cakes, beans, and coffee weak enough to offend no one. Lottie talked through most of it. She explained the difference between the barn cat named Judge and the barn cat named Thief. She described the place in the creek where ice formed first. She told Miriam that her mother had sung while kneading bread, but Papa did not sing because he had a voice like a door hinge. Silas did not defend himself. Miriam asked whether the creek ice held near the edges. Lottie's eyes brightened. It was apparently the correct question. That night, in the small room off the kitchen, Miriam set her tin box under the bed and sat on the mattress without removing her gloves. A roof above her, a closed door, a stove breathing heat through the wall. For nearly a minute, she felt nothing. Then she bent forward with both hands over her mouth, because relief could be as dangerous as grief if it came too fast. By morning, she had found the household ledger. By the third morning, she knew Ash Fork Ranch was not poor because the land had failed. It was poor because someone had learned exactly how much a tired man would not notice. She waited until Lottie was asleep before she placed the ledger on the kitchen table. Silas came in from checking the west fence, snow crusted across his shoulders. He saw the ledger and stood still. Miriam tapped one column. "You have been charged twice for winter oats on 5 deliveries since August." Silas removed his hat. "By whom?" "Arlen Cray submitted the slips. I cannot tell you whether he wrote them or only carried them. But the weights repeat in a way honest weights do not. The same 4,800 pounds appears on 2 different dates. The same freight charge repeats to the cent. And this note here says 3 wagons, when the receipt from the mill says 2. Silas sat across from her. "How much?" $37.60, that I can prove. More if the April and May entries follow the same pattern. The number changed his face. It was not a dramatic change. Silas Holt did not seem built for drama, but the tightness around his mouth gave way to something harder. "That is 2 weeks of feed." "Yes." "That is why I sold the red heifers early." "It is part of why." He looked up. "How do you know books?" "My father repaired clocks and kept accounts for half the shops in Abilene. He said a column of figures was like a locked room. Most people stare at the door. I learned to look for the hinge. Silas was quiet. The stove ticked between them. Wind pressed snow against the window glass. From the room overhead came the small creak of Lottie turning in bed. "That was not in the agreement," he said. "No." "Why show me?" Miriam folded her hands. "Because a leaking roof is not fixed by ignoring the wet floor." The next morning, Silas dismissed Arlen Cray in the yard. Miriam did not watch from the window. She kneaded biscuit dough with her back to the glass and listened to the low voices outside. One voice rose, the other did not. A wagon left before noon. At dinner, Silas set a stack of papers beside her plate. "Hiring letters," he said, "for spring hands." Miriam wiped flour from her fingers. "Do you want them sorted by skill or honesty?" For the first time since she had met him, Silas almost smiled. "Can you tell both from a letter?" "No, but men who lie on paper usually leave crumbs." He pushed the letters closer. "Then look for crumbs." After that, the house changed by degrees too small for anyone to name while they were happening. The stove was lit before dawn. The accounts were moved to the kitchen table, because that was where the lamp burned longest. Lottie began appearing in Miriam's shadow with treasures: a split robin's egg, a button shaped like a star, a black feather she insisted belonged to a crow who was smarter than most adults. Miriam accepted each offering as if it had weight. Silas began leaving firewood inside the back door without mentioning it. Then he repaired the loose pantry latch she had marked with thread. Then he started asking why she had set aside one hiring letter and not another. She answered plainly. He listened completely. That was what unsettled her most. Richard Vale, her late husband, had needed her and resented the need. Men in town had underestimated her and been comforted by the mistake. Silas Holt did neither. He watched her competence the way he watched weather, without flattery, without surprise after the first storm, with an understanding that it could alter the whole day. Miriam did not know what to do with being seen by a man who did not try to make the seeing useful to his pride. Lottie knew exactly what to do with it. One afternoon, she dragged a chair to the kitchen counter and announced she wanted to learn the ledger. Silas looked up from the door. "You're 7. "I can count." "You can count barn cats. That is not the same." Miriam opened the book to a clean page. "It is close enough to begin." Lottie climbed onto the chair with the solemnity of someone entering public office. That evening she wrote the word oats so large it occupied half the page. Silas stared at it, then at Miriam. Miriam said, "A strong heading is not a crime." He looked away, but not before she saw the corner of his mouth move. The first crisis came with ice rain in late December. Silas had ridden to the south pasture at daybreak. By noon, a hired boy named Kip burst into the kitchen, hat in hand, breathless and scared. "The dun cow's down," he said. "Calf's wrong ways. Mr. Holt ain't back." Miriam was already reaching for her shawl. Kip blinked. "Ma'am, I came for Mr. Holt." "You found me." The barn smelled of wet straw, blood, and panic. The cow lay trembling, eyes rolled white, sides heaving hard enough to shake the lantern light. Kip hovered behind Miriam as if courage might be borrowed by standing near it. Miriam took off her gloves. "My father kept milk cows," she said. "Hold the lantern steady. If you faint, fall away from me." Kip held the lantern steady. By the time Silas rode in, soaked through and wild-eyed with worry he had not had time to hide, the calf was alive on the straw, slick and shivering, and the dun cow was breathing like something that had decided to remain in the world after all. Miriam stood at the pump, washing blood from her wrists in water cold enough to make her bones ache. Silas dismounted at the barn door. He looked at the cow. He looked at the calf. He looked at Miriam. "You did that." The calf presented badly. "You turned it?" "Yes." "You could have sent to Miller's place." "Miller's place is 3 miles. The cow was here." He took one step toward her, then stopped, as if the distance between them had become a thing he could either respect or break. "That calf keeps my spring line alive," he said. "I did not help her because she was worth money." "I know." The way he said it made her look at him. His face was wet with rain. His hands were still clenched from riding hard. But his voice had softened around those 2 words, as if he had not merely understood the answer, but recognized the place in her it came from. 2 days later, Bentrey began talking. Kip told the story at the mercantile. By supper, 3 versions existed. By Sunday, Mrs. Bell had decided Miriam Vale was either improper, desperate, or both. The fact that Miriam heard this while measuring brown sugar at the counter did not appear to trouble her much. It troubled Silas. He had been near the stove speaking with the postmaster when Mrs. Bell said, loudly enough for flour sacks to hear, that a woman hired for housekeeping ought not be found in a widower's barn with her sleeves rolled up and his livestock between her knees. The mercantile went still. Miriam set down the sugar scoop. Silas crossed the room. "My housekeeper saved a cow and calf I could not afford to lose," he said. "She did it because she knew how, while the rest of us were not there to know anything. Anyone in this town who finds skill indecent has been wasting too much time in clean rooms." Mrs. Bell's mouth opened. Silas picked up Miriam's sugar parcel. "Miriam," he said, "the wagon is ready." He had never said her name in public before. Outside, the cold hit hard. He placed the parcel in the back of the wagon and climbed up beside her. They drove half a mile before she spoke. "You made it worse for yourself." "No." "You made them look at you." "They were looking at you." "That is not new." He kept his eyes on the road. "It should have been." She had no answer for that. The storm came that night, bringing 2 days of snow heavy enough to erase the fence line. The ranch folded into its own small circle of lamplight and animal breath. Silas slept in pieces, waking to check stock. Miriam kept the fires alive and turned the last apples into a pan of something warm enough to make Lottie lick her spoon. On the second night, after Lottie fell asleep at the kitchen table with her ledger lesson under one cheek, Silas came in from the barn and stood by the stove until the ice on his coat began to melt. Miriam poured him coffee. He sat. "She sleeps when you're in the house," he said. Miriam looked at Lottie's small hand, curled around a pencil. "She sleeps when the house feels held." "It didn't before?" "No." He absorbed that without defending himself. "My wife, Ruth, died in this room," he said after a while. Fever took her fast. I kept thinking if I made the house quiet enough, Lottie would not have to hear what was missing. Miriam folded her hands around her cup. Quiet can protect a wound. It cannot raise a child. Silas looked at her then. There was no anger in his face, only the tired recognition of a man hearing the truth from someone who had earned the right to tell it. And you? He asked. What about me? Who kept your house from going quiet? The question found the place she guarded. She could have stepped around it. She had stepped around worse. But Lottie slept between them, and the storm pressed against the windows, and something about Silas's patience made lying feel wasteful. My son's name was Caleb, she said. He lived 8 months. After he died, people kept saying I was young enough to have another, as if grief were an account that could be balanced by future deposits. Silas closed his eyes briefly. I'm sorry. She believed him because he did not try to add anything. A log shifted in the stove. At last he said, The agreement ends in 29 days. Yes. I was going to ask you to renew it. That is practical. I know. But it is not what you want to ask. He looked down at his coffee. For a man who could face winter cattle, dishonest foremen, and town gossip without flinching, the next sentence seemed to cost him more. Will you stay after it ends? He asked. Not because the paper says, not because the ranch is short-handed, because this house is better with you in it, and I am worse at pretending I do not know that every day. Miriam's throat tightened. Want was a dangerous room. She had locked it. She had placed furniture against the door. Now, somehow, a child had found the latch. Ask me on the last day, she said. Silas nodded once. He did not bargain. He did not press. That mattered more than any speech could have. For the next 2 weeks, the ranch moved as if holding its breath. Then the lawyer's letter arrived. It came from Crowley and Voss in Fort Kearny, folded too neatly and sealed with red wax. Silas carried it into the kitchen with the expression of a man carrying a snake by the tail. Miriam held out her hand. He gave it to her. The letter claimed a missed condition on the North Water lease. According to Mr. Elias Crowley, a clause from Silas's father's old debt allowed a creditor to take control of the spring-fed draw unless $240 were paid within 19 days. Silas stood beside the table while Miriam read the letter twice. If they take that draw, he said, we lose summer water. Yes. That ends Ash Fork. Only if the clause stands. It does. My father signed everything put before him when my mother got sick. Miriam looked up. Where are the old papers? In the cedar box. Bring it. They opened the cedar box on the kitchen table. Deeds, tax receipts, freight notices, old letters tied with cotton string. Silas's father's signature appeared again and again, thin and uncertain near the end of his life. Miriam read until her eyes ached. Lottie sat on the floor nearby, silent for once, sorting buttons into piles no one had requested. Near midnight, Miriam found the hinge. It was not in the deed. It was not in the first loan. It was a rider attached 2 years later, witnessed by the county clerk, and filed under a different parcel name. The rider stated that the North Spring would remain with the ranch so long as annual tax payments on the main homestead were current. Silas's taxes were current. Miriam had paid them from the household account 3 days after arriving because the receipt had been folded into a seed catalog and nearly forgotten. She turned the paper toward him. "This supersedes clause." Silas read it. Then he read it again. "He knows this exists," Miriam said. Silas's jaw moved. "He is counting on me not knowing." "Yes." The lamp burned low. Snowlight filled the window. Lottie had fallen asleep against the flour barrel with a button in each hand. Silas looked across the table at Miriam. "How many rooms have you been in where men hoped you would not know what you were reading?" "All of them," she said. The answer landed harder than she intended. He touched the writer with one finger. "Write the reply." "You should write it." "I will sign it." "You will write it so he understands he chose the wrong house." So Miriam wrote. She cited the writer by date. She named the clerk. She referenced the tax receipts. She gave Crowley 7 days to withdraw the claim in writing or receive a complaint for fraudulent pressure against a recorded instrument. Silas signed his name beneath her words. Kip rode it to town at dawn. The answer came 9 days later. Mr. Crowley regretted the confusion. The creditor would not pursue the North Water lease. No payment was required. Silas read the letter once at breakfast. Lottie watched his face the way children watch weather. Miriam stood at the stove with her hand on the coffee pot, trying not to hope before she understood whether hope was safe. Silas set the letter down. "It is done," he said. Lottie climbed from her chair, walked to Miriam, and took the coffee pot gently from her hand. Then she marched to the sideboard, pulled out the folded work agreement, and laid it in the center of the table. No one spoke. The paper looked smaller than it had in Reverend Pike's office. 3 pages, ink, terms, wages, a beginning and an end. Lottie smoothed it with both palms. "Today is the last day," she said. Miriam closed her eyes. Of course the child had counted. Silas stood. He did not come too close. He had learned the shape of her boundaries before he ever tried to cross one. "Miriam," he said. There it was again, her name, spoken like something chosen. "I can offer wages. I can offer partnership in the accounts. I can offer this house, though it is not always known how to be a home." He swallowed. "But I will not dress need up and call it love. I need you. The ranch needs you. Lottie needs you. That is all true. It is not the question." Miriam looked at him. Behind him, Lottie held herself very still, as if moving might change the answer. Silas laid one hand beside the contract, not on top of it. "The question is whether you want to stay where you are seen." Miriam thought of her boarding room, her tin box, the little cedar marker behind the Methodist cemetery. She thought of every man who had called her useful only after he had run out of easier options. She thought of the stove, the ledger, the calf breathing in straw, the water rider found before midnight, the child who had taken her hand before anyone else dared to. Then she picked up the contract. For one terrible second, Silas went pale. Miriam folded the papers carefully, once, then again. She placed them in the stove. The flame caught the edge, curled it black, and ate the ink that had brought her here. Lottie made a sound that was half gasp, half laugh. Miriam turned back to Silas. "I will not stay under terms that have expired," she said. His face did not move, but something in him seemed to brace. She held out her hand. "I will stay by choice." Silas took her hand as if he had been handed back a life he had not believed could return. Not tightly, not possessively, just with the steady care of a man who understood that what was freely given had to remain free to mean anything. Lottie flung both arms around Miriam's waist. Outside, the north wind moved over the roofs of the barn and smokehouse. The spring-fed draw lay hidden beneath snow, still belonging to the ranch because a woman had read the buried line before a greedy man could use it. Inside, the kitchen held. The stove burned. The ledger lay open. The child laughed into Miriam's apron. Silas Holt stood beside her with his hand around hers, and for the first time in years, the quiet of Ash Fork Ranch did not sound empty. It sounded kept. Miriam had not been rescued. She had been recognized. And sometimes, after the worst has already happened, recognition is the door a person needs in order to choose the rest of her life.